Hey all, here OS Reviews. In this video, we're taking a retro revisited look back at the Sony Handycam HDR PJ710. This camcorder has one pretty cool trick up its sleeve, which you can see here. It has a built-in Pico projector. In fact, Sony had an entire line of projector-enabled camcorders back in the 2000s and 2010s under the PJ series, standing for projectors. But this one in particular is one of the slightly more higher configured models in terms of specs that we'll be revisiting and explore whether you should still consider a camcorder in 2025. Starting off with that unique projector functionality, it's not the brightest in the world, but it is a rather novel way of being able to instantly share any videos or images that you're taking with the camcorder onto a wall or ceiling if you don't have a TV available for you or a group of friends to see in a more immersive way. And although it isn't the highest resolution projector either, it still does a surprisingly decent job of making out most of the images and videos that you're looking at. Oh no. The projector itself does have built-in speakers as well that you can use to listen to audio. We have it muted for this demonstration, but this gives you an idea of what it's capable of. Perhaps not the most critical function in the world to have, but definitely fun to play around with. Kind of extra, but cool in the kind of 2000s, 2010s way of tech still being quite fun. Now, the projector itself also came with some clever features for its time, including the microphone can automatically zoom into people as they were speaking. So there is mic zoom capability. Also, if you're recording maybe a live concert or a street musician, it knows to zoom into the person that is singing and repressing some of the wind noise automatically. It also came with a gimbal stabilization function, which was carried into some of their later generation, including the Sony AX43, AX33, and 53 as some of the last remaining 4K camcorders that are still in production today retain the same steady shot gimbal stabilization, where the lens kind of floats there in space, even if you are slightly moving around, kind of as a precursor to the DJI Osmo Pocket type camcorders, so it makes your footage a little bit more steady. Scrubbing between timeline views, again similar to some other Sony Walkman players as well as PlayStation devices. Even navigating across the general UI of the camcorder for changing some of the system properties could be done using the projector screen. That can be stretched upwards of around, I would say, 60 to 65 inches comfortably, although the further that you go, it will start to lose a little bit more in terms of brightness and resolution, although at night it looks surprisingly decent. So this is the unique kind of projector capability of this particular camcorder series, I would say, as a whole. You're able to engage with that built directly into the articulating folding screen of the projector. And in some ways has made a bit of a resurgence with certain smartphones from Unihertz, for example, coming back, rugged devices that have a Pico projector built into the phone. Even if it's not practical in every case, definitely a bit more fun and wacky, I have to say. Depending on the distance away you are from a wall or surface, there's a little slider here that you can use to twist on and change the focus there manually. Afterwards, the projection capabilities can be turned on and off using a click of a button, which is accented here in blue. So yeah, the projector part is actually very similar on almost all of the PJ series camcorders. Some of them, which are more entry-level, can actually be found for significantly less, although higher spec models in terms of the lens as well as the resolution, like this PJ710, might cost a little bit more. You can see the lens there trying to compensate and move in the opposite direction. And that means if you are walking around outdoors, it's not going to be quite as shaky compared to a lens there which is completely fixed. But again, it's kind of a precursor to the DJI Osmo Pockets that we talked about, but this was the equivalent when camcorders were still the latest trend. The lens on this particular model also seems to be pretty high quality because it is a Zeiss branded Sonnar T-Star coated lens, which starts at a pretty bright f1.8 aperture, letting in plenty of light, which is likely contributing to the slightly higher cost on this particular model. It also features a manual lens focus wheel for a little bit extra pro-grade control. So if you don't want to use autofocus, you can also manually focus and have it lock onto a certain point. In addition to this one having built-in GPS for geotagging the location of your recordings that you can then view back on a map later on, did mean that it retailed back in 2012, so yes, over a decade ago, for around $1,200. So when taking that into consideration, I guess as a vintage piece of tech, at least it is now much more affordable than it was back then. There's also an IR receiver built in here that is compatible with Sony remote controls, including this one here, in addition to smaller ones like the RMT835 is also going to work with this camcorder as well. If you want to have it on a tripod and navigate around the D-pad, if you're in the projector mode, for example, you don't want to touch the screen. Furthermore, aside from built-in LED lights for illuminating objects in slightly darker environments, it has an infrared night shooting mode as well, which captures in a monochrome green color instead, similar to a security camera, which is actually kind of cool. So it's similar to Ghostbusters. You're able to investigate things in the dark, in the woods, and still see at least a couple of meters in front of you without using a torch that might disturb wildlife around you. It's invisible to the human eye at the infrared spectrum. So that is another unique feature, I guess, on one of the slightly higher end versions of these PJ camcorders. And before we dive in deeper into the design and performance, the lens, by the way, also is compatible with certain ring adapter mounts. So for example, you can screw in this one, which converts between 52 millimeters to 37 millimeters. If you wanted to attach additional lens hood, shading the camera when you're in direct sunlight, as well as other converter kits to change it into a more ultra wide angle lens, things like that, which are going to be unique accessories, again, attaching onto the metal part of the camera that is typically not found on more of the entry-level or budget camcorders. Furthermore, under the Sonnar T-Star lens is sitting a sensor which is considered a little larger for a camcorder. Now, this is a point that I was kind of surprised about when looking back, but this thing has a 1/2.8 inch type sensor. I know what you're thinking. If you're comparing that with a point-and-shoot style digital camera or a modern-day smartphone even, that sensor is considered kind of small. In fact, it's in line with a Digicam. Many of those have a 1/2.3 inch type sensor, which is in the same class, give and take. But believe it or not, for a camcorder, that is already considered to be quite good, because the last remaining 4K camcorders from Sony, the AX43, the AX53, and AX33, all have a similar sized 1/2.5 inch type sensor as well. So yeah, the sensors on camcorders, this particular format, has always been a little smaller than their digital camera or Digicam equivalents. And the reason behind that is really because of the optical zoom lens giving you greater magnification. In this particular case, it has a 10 times optical zoom range. It's going to be nice and sharp during that entire duration, and with some additional digital zoom at the end, you can get upwards of 17 times magnification, compared to most of these smaller digital cameras with a similar sensor only having maybe 3 or 5 times optical zoom instead. So of course, as you get more and more magnification, the lens size is also going to get bigger and bigger. And so if you were to cover that lens over a sensor that's also going to be bigger, for example, a 1 inch type sensor or even larger, then the entire package for the camcorder is going to actually increase exponentially, resulting in a setup that will be significantly bulkier and larger to carry around if you wanted to retain the higher zoom reach of a camcorder, which is why, for the sake of portability, many of the consumer camcorders, which can still be easy to hold and travel with, have a smaller type sensor inside in order to accommodate that power zoom lens. Now, my understanding is there are a couple of 1 inch type sensor camcorders on the market, but those are more labeled as prosumer and significantly more expensive. For example, the Sony AX100 is one such instance, but it's also going to be almost 1.5 times longer in terms of the size, and it's still selling typically around the $1,000 mark, which, let's be honest, in 2025, it's quite niche to find typical consumers willing to shell out that much money for a camcorder. But yeah, technically this model will have a more impressive sensor that can get more shallow depth of field, better dynamic range, better low light performance. It's going to be larger, much more expensive. So the next step down is actually going to be a device like this, which is already a step above some of the truly entry-level camcorders. For example, other models that we've seen in the past included the Panasonic TM90, and by comparison, this camcorder has a 1/4.1 inch type sensor, and it was actually released in about the same year. However, it was just a couple of $100 cheaper during the time. And then even more budget-conscious models like the JVC E200BU over here has just a 1/5.8-inch type sensor, which is absolutely tiny and minuscule, especially if we were to compare this with a normal point-and-shoot digital camera. Which is why, under this perspective, the Sony camcorder already has a larger sensor versus the other typical ones that we've seen previously. However, you'll already be able to see that because of that, the Sony camcorder is going to be a little chunkier than the Panasonic and JVC models. At the moment, I would say it's still comfortable enough to travel with, but any bigger than this is going to hit the boundaries between a consumer grade versus a professional camcorder at that point. But also what's interesting is despite, again, the JVC being the smallest, having the smallest sensor, it does have the highest magnification for the lens. This is a true 40 times optical zoom lens, co-branded by Minolta, versus the Panasonic here might indicate that it has 40 times zoom, but actually this is assisted. This is the highest magnification with digital zoom applied, but the actual optical zoom part is only 21 times. So the true, again, optical zoom aspect is already technically 2 times less than the JVC, despite it being a little larger. And then moving into the Sony, we have again 10 times optical zoom with further magnification possible using digital zooming at the end. So you get the idea. Because of the larger sensor size, it means that the entire lens package has to increase in size. But yeah, I would say that aside from reach or getting closer, the higher quality sensor, again, larger surface area, does mean it's able to perform better in terms of colors, contrast, dynamic range, especially if you're shooting in less ideal lighting conditions, where a tiny sensor like this one is going to more quickly deteriorate. In fact, unless you're in perfect outdoor lighting, this particular camcorder is no longer really competitive in terms of image quality at all. Whereas on the PJ710, at least it's still holding up decently, I would say, even by 2025 standards, as you'll see in some of the demo footage later on. Closer look at the hardware, similar to the Sony AX43 that we did a revisited review on about this time last year, the build quality is decent, but not quite as premium as some of their digital cameras, which are also in the enthusiast class, including the Sony RX100 line as compact point-and-shoot style cameras. Side note, they're also using the same Zeiss branded Sonnar T-Star lens, as you can tell there, so that is kind of a reference point that is repeating on some of the Sony products that we've seen, including even a couple of their smartphones like the Xperia 5 as well as Xperia 1 also have a Zeiss T-Star branded lens on there as well. So it's cool to see this partnership between Sony and Zeiss being a German brand kind of across the range of products that they create. However, the main body of the camcorder is still built out of plastic, kind of a coarse fine texture as you can see there, compared to the lens ring parts having some metal accents. Compared to the Sony RX100 line, the entire camera's body, the frame, entirely is built out of metal. Definitely has a more reassuring density to it. Perhaps it's an effort to keep the weight a little bit lower on a larger camcorder, but it is what it is. A few more metal accents here and there. And then on the very top, you'll find also a shoe mount adapter if you want to pop in any external microphones, for example, which is technically missing on some of the more entry-level camcorders. You'll also find the zoom toggle as well as a 2-stage camera shutter key to snap images as well, which can be captured on here at up to 24.1 megapixels. Not bad actually in terms of resolution. On the very bottom here, there's a standard tripod mount, and you can see that this model is also made in Japan. Finally, here on the back, you have access to the removable battery, and furthermore, for charging, you can use either kind of Sony's proprietary charging port, or they have a built-in USB cable on the handle, which is actually quite a convenient feature found on almost all of the Sony Handycam camcorder that I do really like. So you can use this instead to charge it in a pinch, plugging it into a power bank or into a longer USB Type A converter cable into a wall socket, or also transfer data out using this built-in cable as an alternative. Furthermore, there's a little door here that covers up the external mic input, and even another 3.5mm headphone jack for monitoring the audio levels as well in real time. A button here on the back also can be used to instantly switch between video recording and image taking modes, although when you are recording video, you can also tap on the shutter key at any point to capture a snapshot as well. The camera otherwise automatically turns on when you flip open the screen. Usually in just a second or so it's ready to go. It is a resistive touchscreen on here instead of being capacitive, so you have to exert a little bit more pressure. But on here you also find built-in stereo loudspeakers as well as an articulating screen like most camcorders. So it's very flexible in terms of if you want to shoot at a waist level, if you want to completely have it in kind of a selfie or vlogging mode, it unlocks a bit more possibilities compared to a fixed screen, which I think is one of the more convenient aspects of a camcorder form factor. Last but not least, on the inside, you'll find the nightshot mode to activate the IR bulbs, manual power on and off switch, another button for the LED torch, as well as a playback key, and underneath this little flap or door is where you can find the full-size SD card slot, as well as HDMI output that can be used to actually monitor recordings in real time if you want to pass it through a TV or monitor. And it captures using Dolby 5.1 surround sound because of the multitude of built-in microphones here on the top, which are surprisingly loud and capture plenty of audio detail. In fact, connecting the camcorder now to an external display using that HDMI port, you can see the live view as an example here. Again, this is a good example of the low light performance where the larger sensor is making a difference in terms of still picking up sufficient details compared to the smaller sensor camcorders. The zoom toggle is also pretty responsive and it's accelerated based on how fast and hard you're pressing on the switch. So if you go all the way in, you can zoom in more quickly versus a more subtle touch allows you to zoom in a more slow movement as well. The camcorder is also pretty fast to lock in and focus on whatever object you're pointing at, which I guess is one other advantage of a slightly smaller sensor, is there's going to be less bokeh, but perhaps that's on purpose. If you want everything to be in focus at once for documentary, you don't really have to worry about things being too out of focus, although you can use the touchscreen as well to kind of tap on regions that you want to focus on. Macro capabilities are also quite impressive. You're able to get pretty close, as you can tell here. Fine details can be magnified and looking quite sharp automatically, compared to larger sensor cameras typically have a larger minimum focus distance. You have to stand a little bit further back, but that's not the case here, making it quite versatile. And I suppose in super macro situations, you do get some natural bokeh as well. Everything there in the background just becomes a little bit more out of focus in this kind of artistic way. Definitely not bad in terms of the lens performance. Pretty close to the Sony AX33, AX43, and 53 in terms of general quality that I'm seeing. Although those models are capable of recording in 4K resolution, whereas the maximum here is going to be 1080p or Full HD at 60 FPS. But generally speaking, since most TVs and phone screens are going to be around Full HD res anyways, I would say still giving you plenty of detail to work with. Again, since the lens and sensor are all quite similar, to be honest, since it was previously more of a flagship model from them out of their consumer-oriented line. Now jumping into the menu interface of the camera here, you can also choose between options like slow motion recording, camera microphone options in terms of internal versus external microphone, white balance, as well as focusing options, iris, shutter speed can also be adjusted on here. In terms of the image quality here, you can further dial the resolution a little higher or lower, as well as the image resolution can be lowered further as well to use up less space. And for playback, you get a couple more options here as well. Aside from viewing back the entire gallery, you can check out a map view of where some of the content was being recorded, as you can tell here, which is pretty cool. You have an overlay of the entire map region, and then you can zoom into those specific spots. Kind of playful and fun, I have to say, and you can see how at different points in time you are capturing different content just by moving the map view here around, allowing you to perform some basic editing work on the camera itself. Otherwise, under more advanced setup, this is where you can also choose between internal memory versus external memory, because yes, this camcorder also came with 32 gigabytes of built-in system storage, so you can actually record without even plugging in an SD card if you're in a pinch, or of course you can further record to the SD card. So yeah, I would say that overall the camcorder is pretty intuitive and easy to operate, and all the controls, including the remote here, also is relatively responsive, allowing you to zoom in, zoom out smoothly, and again, having a little bit more manual control over all of these aspects like spot metering. Tap to focus, by the way, also enables autofocus tracking, so it's always going to try to lock into the specific point, even as you're panning and tilting further in and out. As you can tell there, it tries to lock itself into place. Twisting on the focus wheel over here, and you can see I'm getting more in and out of focus, so you can rely on this method with a single click, or you can tap again to go into a true autofocus mode.
área feliz. Le texte plus loin écrit sur la pierre de toute la sommaire du monde.
So as shown in those demos, I would say the overall quality of footage that this camcorder is able to reproduce is definitely quite good, especially considering the age of this camcorder that is. And here's a look at that aforementioned LED front light. This is the simple LED version here first. This is what that particular light will be like. Actually not bad for just a simple LED torch, as you can see there, and also not draining too much power because of the LED nature. And let's switch into the nightshot mode here next. This is going to be the IR vision bulb, and you can tell it's actually located at the bottom. Clever enough, it's reusing the same infrared sensor for the remote control and now activating it for a little bit of extra illumination, and a reminder that the IR range is invisible to the human eye. It's only picking up here on camera as this kind of violet color. And now it will look something like this in green. It's also labeled as nightshot there on the display to give you that reminder. So now the room is going to be pitch black, but you can also see how the, again, IR beam makes it possible to still see things in ways that would be invisible to the human eye. Of course, it takes a little bit longer to acquire focus, and everything is in the single monochrome color instead of being full color, but still it's a nice to have feature that you can activate at a click. That being said, perhaps the biggest question that you might have lingering is it still worth it? And I think that's perhaps a harder question to answer, because on one hand, the nostalgic form factor of a camcorder I do really like. The fact you can just grab and go, instantly shoot, and also the entire lens, even though it's a 10 times optical zoom range, is integrated and weather sealed, so it never protrudes or comes out, as compared to most point-and-shoot digital cameras where the lens movement coming in and out might attract or suck in a little bit of dust, might be harder to clean. On here, it just feels a bit more robust because the zoom is happening behind the glass cover. So I personally really like the form factor of camcorders, and one other advantage of a slightly smaller sensor is it never overheats. Maybe because the body here has more space for cooling as well, but you can actually record infinitely as long as there's enough space on an SD card, and I have yet to receive any overheating error message, even if I'm using it outdoors in direct sunlight. So if you put it onto a tripod, connect it to a power supply, you can actually record for hours and hours and hours, compared to on a digital camera. Sometimes there's more of a limitation on how long the video files can be, not to mention the more compact dimensions typically means you might run into more overheating issues after, say, 30 minutes or 60 minutes of continuous recording, not to mention other things to keep in mind, like external microphone input might be more rare to see, as well as the general audio quality from the built-in microphones might not be quite as impressive as this large windshield, Dolby Atmos certified surround sound system built into this camcorder. I think are all aspects of a camcorder that I do think still make sense. But on the other hand, if you're looking at value from the perspective of pure image quality quality, as well as sensor size. And that's where there hasn't been much development in the space of camcorders, because even though there's been a digicam resurgence in the past few years, the popularity of models like the Fuji X100, Sony RX100 have exploded. Over on the video front with camcorders, it hasn't really bloomed in the same way. At least that trend isn't here yet. And what that means is almost all of the larger manufacturers, including Sony, Canon, Panasonic, have more or less kind of moved on and prioritized digital cameras over camcorders. There's very few remaining models in production for the consumer line, that is. It's quite telling that a model from 2012 still has specs considered strong for a camcorder just because there hasn't been as much evolution in this space. And that might be the biggest issue. You aren't focused 100% on video, you're also dabbling in taking images, then perhaps a point-and-shoot camera will still make more sense because they can be found at maybe a similar price point, like a used RX100, which has a even larger 1-inch type sensor, capturing sharper looking images with more bokeh, and still being able to record some shorter snippets of video, all in a body or dimension which is even smaller, more compact. So it's really only when you're looking at video that a device like this still makes sense to some degree, also having that night vision or night recording capability, which is admittedly a function that not many other digicams will have. But yeah, in 2025, I would say some of these hardware features, although really fun to play with, have definitely become a bit more niche unless you are 100% focused on video. But even then, if you want the best image quality, you can arguably get that with a higher end digital camera nowadays as well. Maybe that wasn't the case back in the 2000s and 2010s where the video processing capabilities of cameras were much more limited, but these days certain interchangeable lens mirrorless cameras, as well as even Sony having some 1-inch type vlogging cameras, have all been more optimized for video. And then of course we talked about the DJI Osmo Pocket type devices, which are perhaps even better for vlogging because of how small they are, also having great stabilization, although all of these types of cameras don't have any optical zoom capability. So if you want the increased reach of getting closer to a building, for example, then that's still, I guess, one advantage of a model like this. And then last but not least, the bitter truth is I think for the average consumer, just using your phone camera can also be a really strong alternative because the hardware as well as software processing for phone cameras have gotten so good over the years, having sensor sizes which are about the same as this camcorder now, or in certain extreme cases, flagship phones having even larger sensors like a 1-inch type sensor, although this is a fixed pancake lens. It doesn't have any optical zoom on that main lens, but still, you get the point. It can deliver excellent quality results thanks to a combination of that hardware as well as software processing, and it's something that you always have in your pocket. So yeah, it puts camcorders, I think, in kind of a precarious place, because as the saying goes, the best camera is the one that's always with you, the one that's in your pocket. Yet, on the other hand, I found myself enjoying using the Sony camcorder more than I was really anticipating or expecting because of all the fun little extra features, the manual knobs and controls, which are so satisfying to use. And I guess to a niche group of people, something like this can still be beneficial. Like we mentioned, recording for longer durations, hours and hours and hours, having true optical zoom reach, integrated with an ergonomic design that's comfortable to grip, night vision, I guess can still be reasons to consider something like this, even if, again, the popularity of camcorders have sadly been superseded by modern digital cameras, which can also dabble in increasingly good video quality, as well as just our smartphones in general, iPhones, Pixels, Samsung Galaxies, even Sony's own camera smartphones. But yeah, this was definitely a cool moment in tech history, and I still think that these Projector series of camcorders from Sony were rather unique and quirky looking back. Actually quite fun. You can check out more details if you're interested in something like this in the links down below, but for now that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That has been the Sony Handycam PJ Projector series, more specifically the PJ710 Revisited.